two material thoughts. One is, I wonder to what extent you have investigated the place where, if anywhere, something like the Morgenthau Plan was put into effect, which is in the Eastern Zone. And the way in which you would find, I think, sharply differential, even with lousy data from the East, sharply differential results of that, or might actually find some things that would reinforce your question. The second thing is, and this is really sort of tangential, there was discussion after the war of the huge Western, particularly British and American, seizure of German intellectual property through the BIOS and CAIOS and Fiat operations. And there is at least some argument that this was a vastly smarter move than to try to collect debts, but rather simply to steal intellectual capital, which was done, and I've seen hundreds and hundreds of these reports, particularly in chemicals and plastics and metallurgy and so on and so forth. And I'm not sure whether that fits into your story anyway, or whether it might be useful.
Yeah. Okay, let me start with the second thing. I'm not going to say too much about it because one of the experts is sitting next to me and I don't want to make a fool of myself. One could, of course, to turn your thing on its head, call this the Germanization of American industry. But
quite cheerfully too.
Yeah. Next question then is next question then is how big was that damage really? Very tricky. Why? Because many of the patents were of course taken out in war-relevant industries. There are of course all these jokes in Germany about the Nazis putting a man in the moon. Like, the Werner von Braun, the guys who had developed DB2. Yeah, there are these stories. Next question then, of course, after that is how important were these programs really for the growth of the American economy? It's not clear. Yeah? The counter argument is that there is Americanization of German industry, and you actually see some of it already in the 1930s. Germany's war machinery, to some extent, works on the conveyor belts delivered to German car industry in the late 1930s from America. The Volkswagen and the Auto Works and all this is Ford, all this was stuff that basically went with American factory equipment. That was kind of delivered again in the 1950s and slightly more advanced version, and then we are back to that. The Morgenthau plant, its Eastern version, hugely interesting because it's much more complex than anything. And that goes back to your point about so to speak, I rephrase this now, the limits of exploitation. And it turns out that what the Soviets intend is a Mongolian piece, and they end up somewhere between the Carthaginian and a not so Carthaginian piece. Here's what's happening. Two rivaling teams arrive from Moscow, or three. Two. One is just take out every piece of machinery that you can possibly get hold of, and also make sure that they catch the engineers and bring them to Russia. So that's probably a bit smarter than the Americans did. What the Americans did, because they take the hardware along as well. Another German joke from the 1950s was that there was not just one Nazi rocket program, but actually two of them. One was the American one, the other one was the Russian one. And they used two different technologies developed by two different teams. The first one had the idea of making the rocket engines bigger and bigger. And the other one said it's far too complicated because we run into metallurgical problems that we cannot solve, so let's bundle them. And that second thing is what the Soviets did. Again, what exactly was the use to the Soviet economy, so that's not exactly that. Soviet economic officers did the math and found this and found out about this too. And then what we see from the internal Soviet documents of the late 1940s, it starts in 47, so 46, 47, is there's a huge internal battle between those who want to continue dismantling and those who say this is completely crazy, we need to stop this immediately because we are much more productive if we leave the equipment and the people where they are and take reparations out of current production, which we can do because we can enforce transfers. They understand the transfer problem as well, and they say no. Basically, like the American counterparties, they have their own clays, the clay equivalents, who say it's completely crazy to destroy the German industry capacity, while we actually would need their products back home. So let's get them back to work, and that's a policy that the Soviets adopted in 1947. Now there is a big issue with East German historians about the actual amount of dismantling. They keep telling us the story from their data that dismantling was huge and much bigger than in the western zones of occupation. But then if you look at the data they cite, my impression is this doesn't add up, and maybe the reduction of capitalist stock in East Germany is actually much less than they thought. The reason why everybody has believed in the Mongolian version of the Mongolian narrative, okay, of that is first of all the Soviet invasion in East Germany was not particularly pleasant, and second the Soviets dismantled the second rail from the railway connections, and that was an effect that you could still see in the 1980s because train connections were disaster. So everybody had this feeling, oh yeah, of course they reduced it to rubble and you can see it, but it's probably deceptive.
Jeff?
One of them is, in terms of the questions of war and peace, which were in everyone's mind, and I think Brad did a wonderful job of bringing that out. It seems to me the best analogy to the Morgenthau Plan is not a Carthaginian peace, because in fact the Carthaginian peace was total destruction. It's really, it's the kind of peace that would impose permanent hegemony and subordination. So really, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. Maybe it would be a Brest-Litovsk peace. Brest-Litovsk. In other words, the kind of peace that Germany and the Pan-Germans wanted to impose on Eastern Europe. But leaving that aside, I mean, the point is that they didn't, and that comes back to the larger issue that you want to raise in terms of potential historical analogies from which we can learn between then and now. In the current European discussions, I don't think they're so worried about geopolitical questions in that sense. Nobody's quite worried that there'll be a resurgence of militarism in Italy and possible wars. The real question you want to raise is, why did they not realize the incredible short-sightedness of the creditor nations back during that period? And recognize that enlightened self-interest would involve a different approach. And there, it seems to me that there is a consensus between the three different speakers that in terms of the solution that was actually arrived at, a major part of it had to do with a willingness to sanction debt relief, certainly in the case of Germany.
Willingness to sanction?
To sanction debt relief.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
That was a major, I mean, everybody seems to agree with that, but that's a major part of it. And the other consensus that seems to emerge from the three is that the policy that actually was adopted is a testimony to the importance of historical contingency. It was a very near-run thing that there were several possible options that the American government could have taken several options, and in retrospect, it's almost amazing. They chose that option, which turned out in retrospect to be so successful. But finally, it seems to me that all of you agree that part of what made that, there were a lot of different features that contributed to that outcome, which I think would have to include a certain kind of quasi-Keynesian hegemony, and the fact that the residue of the New Deal was still running through the American government. But two factors seem to be critical, and they're brought out both, I mean, really by all three of you, this very peculiar combination of fear and self-confidence. On the one hand, if the Americans had not been afraid of the Soviets, it would have been very hard to push this through. Not only within the government, but it's well known that the only way to get the Marshall Plan and NATO and all that through Congress was to frighten the wits out of the country, as Vandenberg said to Harry Truman. But that went together with the fact that at that point, sensible Americans recognized the United States was in this uniquely hegemonic position in the non-Soviet world. It had overwhelming military power and also felt overwhelmingly economically self-confident. Now, those two factors in combination, the collective fear, which would lead one to loosen short-term self-interest, and this overwhelming sense of economic and geopolitical self-confidence have no parallels in the current European situation. if one wanted to draw an analogy, I think that would lead to a depressing conclusion. If it took those, then neither of those is there. I mean, everybody outside of Germany thinks of Germany as being overwhelmingly hegemonic, but Germans, no, they're not in remotely the situation that the United States was. And they're not afraid of anybody, especially the Greeks. If they were afraid the Greeks might, come back and conquer Europe, okay, they'd be willing to help them out. Does that strike you as a reasonable historical lesson to draw?
That's quite interesting indeed. That's very good. That's very good. Okay, let's see. The short-sightedness of the creditor nations. Yes, there are a few things that I haven't really elaborated on in the paper. One is that the post-war economic arrangement or order in Europe was to a large extent kind of organized around these German resource transfers. It was done in a nice way. It was not reparations. It really kind of helped to the accumulation of foreign wealth or foreign property rights, which wouldn't have been so bad because from time to time there were these little tectonic shifts, periodic devaluations, which would devalue some of this foreign wealth. That channel of adjustment has been shut down with the Eurozone. What we see is that, at least in book value, German foreign wealth is shooting up. Essentially, what the current crisis needs to drive home to Germany, and we aren't there yet, is what you nicely call the willingness to become an importer of last resort. You won't believe how few people understand the connection between monetary transfers and resource transfers. How many journalists are asking me, so why cannot the Greeks and the Italians simply repay their debt? And I keep telling them it's all very fine. Let's shut down Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes and only drive Fiat cars, right? And now it's crisis. And let's only go vacationing in Greece and probably even relocate there. And then there is probably a chance to do this. Basically, what we would be talking about is a long-term commitment to running trade deficits with Southern Europe. Now, this is in all likelihood not going to happen. That's pretty clear. If we next question then is, do we need a massive amount of wage deflation in Southern Europe? That depends on whether we think the economic shock dealt to the economy in 2008 is permanent or highly persistent. If it is, then that's what we need. The good news from Germany is that there was a not much discussed wage increase in manufacturing last year, which was last spring, which was 4%. So that's also good. So at least the decrease in German labor cost has been. The consensus in terms of the solution, the willingness to sanction debt relief, that is, of course, I mean, here we are ahead of the curve. Here we are ahead of much of the thinking in Germany or in Europe. This is a relatively new insight. You now read it in the press all the time. But that's really a matter of the past 3 weeks. It has been greatly helped by the Troika saying that. By the so-called Troika saying this advisory team.
Troika.
Right, Troika. Yeah. But it's clearly a new thing. The self-confidence and the amazing success and the question why confronted with the choice, America was able to choose that solution and get away with it. There's one element that I haven't mentioned, which is the incredible amount of expertise that America had on Germany. That is to some extent a New Deal thing, but not only. There's another element, and this is also something I've never seen a book on this, which is German immigrants in the U.S. Army. People who know their Nazis extremely well, who know the legal system, who have a law degree from Germany, who have engineering degrees from Germany, who simply they know institutions with address and house number and everything, and that's of course extremely important. It's one of the reasons why liberal intervention in other places, long after World War II, is utterly unsuccessful because there's apparently a lack of expertise. a certain administration went into Iraq and apparently had no clue about what they were doing. Yeah? The military campaign was not an issue, of course, it was over after 3 weeks.